Hey guys, this is the first installation of our upgrades on the Gen 7. This one is going to be what I call the free-ish upgrades. This is going to be the upgrades or the improvements that we can make that don't cost anything, or the very most cost very, very little. What we're planning on doing is to trim the drive shaft. We're going to move and trim the bumpers. I'm going to countersink the screws in the lower transmission plate. And we're also going to reposition the shocks in hopes of getting a little bit more compliance out of the shocks. With the exception of the countersink screws that you would need for the skid, everything else is completely free. The screws you should be able to find for a couple of bucks if you don't already have some in your bin. So we're going to go ahead and get started and see how this works out. So the first issue that we're going to address is going to be the drive shaft. As I mentioned in my intro video, when you compress the rear suspension, you can get to a certain point. If you go any farther, if you watch, you're going to see the whole transmission start to move. That whole assembly starts to move because the drive shaft is bottoming out. So we're going to go ahead and pull off the drive shaft and make our changes. So to get the rear differential out, we're going to have to do a few things. We're going to start by taking the wheels off, and then once the wheels are off, we're going to disconnect the 4 linkages and the shocks from the rear diff. So we'll go ahead and do that, and then we'll come right back. Okay, so I took the wheels off just to make this a little easier. You don't have to take the wheels off. You can get to this from underneath, but I think this makes it a little bit more clear. To get the drive shaft off, you've got a couple of 1.5 millimeter set screws. You've got one on each end. You've got this one here, and then you've got the one up at the transmission. You can probably just get away with taking one of them off, but since I'm actually going to be taking the rear differential out for other upgrades, I'm just going to go ahead and take them both off. So we'll do that, and then I'll come back. All right, guys. So I took the rear drive shaft out, and this is the piece that was on the transmission, and this is what we need to trim. And what we're going to do is trim about 1/4 inch or 3/8 off of here, and then we'll put it back in and see how it works. Alright, so I went ahead and cut this. After I cut it, I just used the Dremel with a cutoff wheel to cut the end off, and then a little bit of sandpaper to smooth over the edges. One more thing I want to mention before I put this back together, even though I'm not doing it today, is that one way that you can stiffen these up, because these have a tendency to twist, if you look and see that there's a hole in the middle, these are hollow, you can take a screw. This is an M10. M4 is a little bit small, but an M10 seems to work, and I think a metric M5 would probably also fit if you have some of that around. This is a screw, but what you really want to do is get some threaded rod. I don't have any, so I'm not doing this upgrade today, but while it was apart, I wanted to show it to you guys. And you can just screw the threaded rod all the way in, so it goes all the way up, and then cut off the edge of the threaded rod, and that'll add some strength to this and help keep it from twisting, especially if you use a little bit of epoxy on the threads before you put them in. That way this will finish up rock hard and won't be able to twist. But anyway, we've got this cut, and now we're going to go ahead and put it back in and see how it worked. Right, so now we've got this reinstalled, and when we flex the suspension, you can see that we can bottom out the shocks completely, and the transmission doesn't move. So taking a little bit off of that drive shaft, I think, really helped out. Okay, so next we're going to deal with relocating the bumpers, and the first bumper we're going to deal with is the rear bumper. The rear bumper, the only thing I really want to do is move it up. I don't really want to tuck it in anymore because I'm not sure how good it'll look, although we can try. But if we come to the side here, even with the full flex, you can see that the tire's nowhere near the bumper. And I haven't had any real problems with getting the rear bumper hung up, but we're going to pull it up a little bit, and we'll see how that works out. Alright, so to raise this bumper up, it's going to be a pretty simple process. All we have to do is turn this bracket around. If I flip this bracket over and mount it, it'll allow me to bring it up 1 notch. And while I'm at it, I'm going to try pulling the bumper in to see how it looks. If I don't like it, then I'll just put the bumper back where it is. But I'll zip these off, and then we'll take a look. Alright, so now the bumper bracket is flipped over. You can see now that the posts are up near the upper part instead of down below. And I also moved the bumper in 1 spot. Even with the bumper out where it was going to be necessary to trim the body. So this isn't going to really have any effect on that. So I'm going to go ahead and trim the body, and then we'll see how it sits. So So the body's all trimmed up, and while I was at it, I went ahead and relocated the license plate decal. And overall, I think things fit pretty well, and it's still nowhere near the rear tires. So I'm going to call this a success. On to the front. So here's the front, and on the front we're going to have a little bit more work to do, because even as it sits now, this wants to come right in contact, especially when things are turned. So it's going to be a little bit trickier, because I do want to push this back. I'm going to try going up with it also, and I think we're going to have to trim away some of the extra out here. So I'm going to experiment with it, and then I'll come back when I've got a better plan. So I went ahead and moved the bumper back one spot, and I kind of like this position because the body still fits pretty well. If I move the bumper up, I'm going to have to trim the front of the body, which I really don't want to do if I can avoid. Now we have a lot more contact here, so we're going to have to end up trimming quite a bit. So I think what the plan is going to be here, because I'm going to have to trim into here, we're going to get rid of this section of the bar, which I was never really fond of anyway. But because we do have an LED set that we want to put into the bumpers, I don't want to trim all the way into here. So we're going to try trimming to here and maybe trim back at an angle and see how that works. Alright, so we went ahead and trimmed the bumper. You can see that it's a little bit short now compared to where it was. And if I fully compress the suspension, it does still rub. But I want to actually drive it before I actually cut more away, because I think this is going to be enough. Because it's one thing to fully compress the suspension, it's another thing to let it articulate naturally. And when it articulates naturally, you can actually see that right now I have enough clearance, and I'm actually rubbing the body. And I did trim the body just a tad. And because of the fact that I'm on the body more than the bumper, I think this is going to be adequate. So we're going to give it a try. If we need to trim it a little bit more, we will. But I really don't want to take any more bumper away than necessary. So overall, that was a pretty easy project, and I think it's going to help us out by moving this bumper back a little bit. It should give me a little bit more capability when I'm going up some steep inclines or approaching something steep. So we'll give it a try and see what happens. Okay, so we went ahead and relocated the shocks. The original hole was this hole right here, and I moved them over here, which doesn't change the height very much, but it lays them down a little bit and it makes things a little bit more compliant. It's not a big difference, but I think it's going to help a little bit. We'll find out when we drive it. And short of putting new oil and new springs in the shocks, it's really about the best you can do. Now, putting new oil in the shocks really isn't a big deal, but I think the springs on these shocks are so stiff that if you put lighter oil in these shocks without changing the springs, you're going to get kind of a bouncy suspension. So for now, we're going to just try to move these forward and see how it works. One thing to note is that in order to be able to move these forward, you also have to turn around this assembly here. This assembly here, as you can see, is what the shocks actually screw into. And with this turned around backward for it to fit in the original shock hole, if I was to move these shocks forward, I wouldn't be able to attach them unless I wanted to use a separate nut. Rather than do that, I just went ahead and turned around this tower, and everything worked great. So that's just something that you're going to want to be aware of. So next on our list of free things to do is to countersink the screws that are poking out of the skid plate. These are what mount the transmission, and by countersinking them, it'll just help prevent them from getting hung up on stuff. Okay, so we've gone ahead and countersunk one of these. You can see this one right here is countersunk. So anyway, I'm going to do the other three. Then I'll show you what it came out to look like. Okay guys, so we went ahead and countersunk all four of the screws. One thing worth mentioning is that the screws that come out of this are kind of a coarse thread screw, which I'm sure you're not going to be able to see here. And the screws I used are actually a fine thread screw, which wasn't really a problem. I used about the same length until I had a screw where it decided to bring the plastic with it when I removed it. So what I did was go to a longer screw. You can see this is the screw here that I used. It's quite a bit longer than those other screws, but I didn't have any issues. All four holes were deep enough. I was able to drive these longer screws in. We've got real good thread engagement and everything tightened up real nice. So now we've got this all nice and countersunk, which I don't think it'll make a big difference, but it should at least make it a little bit more predictable when it's sliding over obstacles. Alright guys, so we've finished all of the free-ish upgrades, and just like I promised, you're only going to be spending about $2 for this whole series. And overall, I think we've got a much improved vehicle. I think the rear suspension works better, not only because of the shocks being laid down a little bit, but because now we don't have any binding, thanks to that trimmed drive shaft. And the bumpers now are a little bit better. There's still some rub at full lock with full articulation, but like I said in the video, I want to try to drive it before we go any further. You could always trim it even more, depending on your needs and interests. And lastly, we have the countersunk screws. So our total investment in this vehicle so far is $202. So stay tuned for the next video as we go into our next upgrade. Thanks, guys.